The palace was quiet, but Kale knew the peace would not last. The rogue faction had retreated temporarily, but their anger and determination were stronger than ever. They had seen what a human could accomplish, and that realization had made them. Reckless Kale, however, remained calm. He understood that the key to survival and to victory was not in rushing or showing aggression, but in preparation, observation, and timing. The following morning, Kale reviewed the security systems. Once again, he moved through corridors lined with glowing energy conduits, checking redundancies, patterns, and weak points that no one else seemed to notice. The Zetherians trusted their technology implicitly, assuming that centuries of refinement made their defenses flawless. Kale knew otherwise. Flawless systems could still fail if they relied solely on predictability. Humans excelled in unpredictability, and Kale planned to use that advantage to its fullest. Livrin joined him, walking silently through the corridors. "The faction will strike again soon," he said. His voice carried a tension Kale had not heard before. "They are desperate. They will not be careful this time." Kale nodded, "which is exactly why they will fail. Desperation makes people predictable. They rely on emotion, not logic. That is their weakness." The prince studied him, his eyes glowing faintly. He had learned much in the past weeks. The human had not only neutralized threats, but had also shown the subtle power of observation, patience, and ingenuity. Livrin realized that Kale's strength was unlike anything he had seen before. It was quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable in a way that did not need recognition or display. Hours later, the rogue faction made their move. This time their attack was more coordinated, targeting multiple systems simultaneously. Alerts rang throughout the palace, and engineers scrambled. To respond, Kale moved calmly through the chaos, analyzing each signal, predicting each step of the intruder's plan. While the Zetherians reacted frantically, Kale anticipated their moves and countered them with precision. He coordinated with a small team of trusted engineers, giving simple but effective instructions. Each adjustment, each reroute, and each subtle modification worked to neutralize the attacks. The rogue faction grew frustrated, unable to understand how their carefully planned strikes were failing. They expected chaos. They expected panic. But Kale's calmness created control where none was expected. Livrin observed silently from the council chamber, unable to intervene. He could see the human's mind at work, a web of thought connecting patterns, anticipating actions, and exploiting weaknesses. Kale had transformed the palace itself into a living defense, using intelligence and subtle strategy rather than brute force. In the central control hub, Kale identified the key element of the rogue faction's plan, a device designed to overload the planetary shield. The Zetherians had never considered how it could be countered through indirect measures. Kale, however, saw the opportunity immediately. By rerouting energy through auxiliary grids and introducing calculated feedback loops, he could neutralize the device without confrontation. The engineers followed his instructions precisely, though many were skeptical at first. Kale's confidence, however, was undeniable. He did not need to explain in detail. He simply guided them through subtle steps that had a profound effect. Within moments, the rogue device was isolated, its power neutralized, and the planetary shields remained stable. The rogue faction's members were stunned. Their plan, executed with precision and confidence, had failed. Kale had anticipated their every move without force, without anger, and without seeking attention. Their frustration grew, and they made mistakes, small errors that Kale had predicted. Each misstep allowed the palace defenses to tighten further. Trapping the intruders and preventing further sabotage, Livrin finally approached Kale in the control hub, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You have done the impossible," he said quietly. "Where our best strategists failed, you succeeded. And you did it without pride, without arrogance, and without needing recognition. How is this possible?" Kale looked at him calmly. "It is not about power or recognition," he said. "It is about understanding, seeing patterns, anticipating actions, and acting when the moment is right. Humans have survived by doing this. For centuries, we do not need to dominate to be strong. We survive because we think, adapt, and endure. The prince considered this, realizing that Kale's philosophy was as remarkable as his skill. Humans measured success differently from Zetharians. They relied on ingenuity, subtle strategy, and resilience rather than status, hierarchy, or brute. Force Kale had not only defended the palace, but he had also taught a lesson. Intelligence and adaptability could triumph over arrogance and technological superiority. By midday, the rogue faction had been captured, their plan dismantled completely. The palace was secure once again, and the Zetharian court began to acknowledge Kale's contributions, though many were reluctant to admit it openly. Livern, however, had changed entirely. The young prince, once dismissive and arrogant, now regarded Kale with a quiet respect that bordered on admiration. He had witnessed firsthand that humans were not weak, fragile, or unremarkable. They were unpredictable, resourceful, and capable of incredible feats of strategy. Despite the praise from Livern and the subtle acknowledgement from the court, Kale did not seek attention. He walked through the palace gardens, the twin moons casting silver light on the marble paths. The events of the past weeks had reinforced a truth he carried with him. Humans were strong because they adapted, because they thought differently, and because they acted when others hesitated. Recognition was irrelevant. Results were what mattered. Livern joined him once again, walking silently beside the human. "I underestimated your kind," he admitted. "I thought humans were weak, limited, and incapable. I see now how wrong I was. You have proven that strength is not always visible. It can be subtle, quiet, and unstoppable." Kale nodded. "Underestimation is often a mistake," he said simply. "It has been the downfall of many species throughout history. Humans survive because we anticipate, adapt, and act without the need for recognition. That is our advantage." The prince fell silent, contemplating the words. For the first time, he realized that his people's arrogance had blinded them to possibilities beyond their rigid thinking. Kale had not only defended the palace and planet, but had also changed the perception of humanity in the eyes of the Zetharians. The insult that had begun their acquaintance, the mocking of his species, was now irrelevant. Kale had proven, through action and intelligence, that humans were formidable. The following days were calm, though Kale remained vigilant. The rogue faction had been subdued, but the palace and planet were never completely safe. Kale continued to observe, learning, and subtly guiding improvements to the systems. His presence became a quiet influence on the court, a reminder that intelligence, ingenuity, and adaptability were as important as any technology. Livern often sought his counsel, not to challenge him, but to learn. The young prince had begun to appreciate that humans could contribute in ways the Zetharians had never considered. The lessons Kale had taught were subtle, indirect, and powerful. They would shape the future of the court, and perhaps even the way the Zetharians approached challenges in the galaxy. Kale, however, did not linger for recognition. One night, under the silver glow of the moons, he walked through the palace halls quietly, observing the calm that followed the storm. He had acted decisively, protected the planet, and influenced the court, yet he remained uncelebrated. It was how humans operated. Their impact was not measured by applause or status. It was measured by results and the quiet assurance that survival was secured. Livern, standing at the edge of the gardens, watched Kale disappear into the moonlight. The young prince had learned humility, respect, and the subtle power of human ingenuity. The insult he had once delivered, the mocking of a human as weak and unremarkable, was now a memory overshadowed by admiration.
Oh, yes.
He understood that humans were different, yes, but that difference made them extraordinary. Kale paused briefly, looking back at the palace. He knew his work here was not done, but he also knew that his presence had left an indelible mark. The rogue faction had been neutralized, the palace secured, and the young prince had learned that humans could not be underestimated. He had turned insult into opportunity, observation into strategy, and patience into power. As he stepped out into the moonlit gardens, Kale allowed himself a small smile. He had not sought recognition, he had not demanded respect, and he had not reacted with anger or pride. And yet, through calm, intelligence, and subtle action, he had proven the truth that humanity had always known. Underestimating humans is a mistake in their resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability are forces to be reckoned with. The palace, the court, and the young prince would never forget what a single human could accomplish. Kale, however, moved silently into the night, leaving the court to reflect on what they had witnessed. Sometimes true power does not demand attention, it simply acts, quietly and decisively, shaping outcomes and teaching lessons that words alone could never convey. The moons shone brightly over the palace, as Kale disappeared into the shadows, leaving the Zetherians to their thoughts. It arrived as a diplomat, faced insult and mockery, and yet had left an enduring mark not. Kale had settled into a rhythm of quiet observation and subtle intervention, but he knew the palace's calm was temporary. The rogue faction had been slowed, but their determination remained. The Zetherian court continued to underestimate him. Believing that a human's intelligence could never match centuries of alien technological advancement, Kale knew that was exactly why he had the advantage. While they relied on rigid logic and predictable protocols, humans could improvise and adapt. He had already proven that, and now the stakes were rising. One morning, Kale was called to the Central Council chamber under unusual circumstances. Livrin had requested his presence not publicly, not with ceremony, but privately. The corridor leading to the chamber was quiet, lined with holographic displays that projected star maps, fleet movements, and planetary systems. Kale noticed subtle anomalies in the energy readings along the walls. Rogue operatives were attempting to infiltrate the palace again, but this time their methods were more aggressive, more direct. Livrin awaited him, standing beside a table displaying the security protocols of the planetary defense systems. His expression was tense, a mixture of pride, frustration, and concern. "Kale," he began, his voice steady, "the situation is worse than we anticipated. The rogue faction has acquired a weapon capable of bypassing our shields. If they succeed, the planet will be vulnerable. We need a solution quickly." Kale studied the displays, analyzing the data with careful precision. The weapon was unlike anything he had seen, a combination of Zetherian technology repurposed for destruction. Its complexity was staggering, but Kale focused on the patterns. While the Zetherians relied on brute force countermeasures, considered indirect strategies, disruption, misdirection, and exploiting assumptions that the faction had made about the court's predictability. "I need access to the energy conduits," Kale said, his voice calm. "And I need a few engineers who trust me completely." Livrin nodded, silently impressed by the human's confidence. While the prince had initially sought to test Kale, he now realized that humans were not just capable, they were essential in situations where rigid logic could fail. As Kale moved through the palace corridors, he quietly coordinated with his chosen engineers. They followed him without question, trusting his calm certainty. The human's plan relied on timing, precision, and subtle improvisation. He did not need weapons, not in the conventional sense. His tools were observation, intelligence, and the ability to anticipate moves before they happened. The first step was to create controlled disruptions in the palace's energy grid. Kale introduced subtle fluctuations, carefully designed to mimic natural system anomalies. The rogue faction, expecting flawless operation, reacted immediately, assuming the disturbances were weaknesses to exploit. Kale had anticipated this, setting traps within the systems that would isolate and contain their interference. Meanwhile, Rin observed from the council chamber. He had called the council together not to intervene, but to witness. The young prince's metallic eyes followed Kale as he moved through the complex network of conduits, rerouting energy flows and synchronizing minor systems in ways that seemed chaotic but were meticulously calculated. Each adjustment countered the rogue faction's attacks, often before they even realized what had happened. Hours passed in tense silence. The palace hummed with energy, lights flickered, and alarms rang briefly before settling. Kale's plan was working, but he knew the rogue faction would escalate if they discovered his interventions. His mind raced, considering the next moves, predicting the faction's psychology, and planning several steps ahead. Humans excelled in this kind of abstract thinking, seeing patterns where others saw random events. As the first of the rogue operatives attempted to access the central weapon, Kale activated his final contingency. Using a combination of energy, redirection, and timing, he created a loop that trapped the intruders in a cycle of false access signals. Each time they thought they were succeeding, the system corrected itself, isolating their actions and rendering the weapon inactive. The operatives became frustrated, unable to predict the human strategy, and began making mistakes exactly as Kale had anticipated. Livrin, watching closely, felt a mixture of awe and unease. The human's ingenuity was undeniable. Kale had acted decisively, yet without aggression, without seeking recognition, and without breaking a sweat. He was proving to the prince that human intelligence was not loud or obvious, but subtle, precise, and ultimately unstoppable when applied correctly. Rogue faction, realizing they had been outmaneuvered, attempted a desperate final assault. They aimed to bypass the palace entirely, attacking from outside the planetary shield. Kale had anticipated this too. Using predictive modeling and unconventional thinking, he coordinated with the engineers to create decoy energy signals that misled the faction into thinking their attack had succeeded. The moment they committed to the false path, Kale rerouted the real energy to defensive grids. Neutralizing the threat entirely, silence fell over the council chamber as the final alert cleared. The planet's systems were secure, the rogue faction contained, and the palace remained unscathed. Livrin could not hide his admiration. He approached Kale quietly, without ceremony. "You have done what we could not," he said. "And you did it without force, without arrogance, without need for recognition. You are remarkable." Kale nodded calmly. "I do not seek praise," he said. "The objective was protection, not glory. If the threat is neutralized, the mission is complete." Livrin studied him for a moment, realizing that human values were different from Zetharian ones. While his people prized power, status, and recognition, humans measured success by effectiveness, ingenuity, and resilience. Kale had demonstrated all three, and in doing so, it shifted Livrin's understanding of what strength truly meant. The council chamber buzzed as the advisors began to recognize the human's contribution. Some were reluctant to admit it, constrained by pride and tradition, but even they could not deny the results. Kale had succeeded where the Zetharians had failed, not through superior technology, but through the unpredictable brilliance that only a human could bring. That night, Kale walked alone in the palace gardens. The twin moons reflected in the calm pools, casting a silver glow across the flowers and trees. He reflected on the events of the day, understanding that victory was temporary and challenges would continue. The rogue faction had been slowed, but not eliminated. And yet, Kale felt no fear. Humans thrived in situations where others expected failure, not through force, but through ingenuity, patience, and adaptability. Livrin joined him again, standing quietly at the edge of the garden. "You are different from anyone I've ever met," the prince said softly. "And yet I wonder, if your species is so capable, why have you not dominated as we have?" Kale considered the question. "Dominance is not the same as survival." He said, "Humans survive because we adapt, because we think differently, and because we act when others hesitate. We do not need to dominate to be strong. Our strength lies in our resilience and ingenuity." The prince's expression softened, a hint of respect now mixing with curiosity. Livrin had spent his life surrounded by beings who conformed to expectations, who measured power through obedience and recognition. Kale's quiet strength challenged everything he knew. Humans were unpredictable, resourceful, and unrelenting, and now we could see that clearly. Over the next days, Kale continued to move through the palace, observing, learning, and preparing. For the next phase, he knew that the rogue faction would return, more determined than ever. They would attempt new methods, exploit weaknesses, and push the Zetharians to their limits. But Kale was ready, relied not on force, but on understanding, strategy, and human ingenuity, the same qualities that had kept his species alive against impossible odds throughout history. Livrin, once arrogant and dismissive, now began to consult Kale more frequently. Their conversations were quiet, subtle, and often philosophical. The prince realized that humans measured success differently, that their value was not in technology or physical power, but in intelligence, creativity, and resilience. Kale's actions had forced a shift in perspective, not just for Livrin, but for the palace itself. As the twin moons rose high in the sky, Kale reflected on the events of the past weeks. He had turned insult into motivation, observation into advantage, and patience into power. The rogue faction had been contained, the palace secured. The young prince had begun to recognize the quiet brilliance of humanity. Yet Kale knew this was not the end. Challenges would continue, as they always did. But humans thrived where others failed, not through brute force, but through the subtle application of ingenuity, adaptability, and patience. And Kale silently had proven that even in the most advanced and arrogant court in the galaxy, a human could make a difference. The lesson was clear. Underestimate humans at your own risk, for they could survive, adapt, and triumph in ways that no one expected. Kale's days in the Zithrian palace had settled into a rhythm, though a tense one. While he had successfully thwarted the first attempts of the rogue faction, he knew the real challenge was yet to come. Zithrians were proud and methodical, relying on predictable logic and their advanced technology. Kale, however, thrived in unpredictability. The more he observed, the more he understood that while the Zithrians were powerful, their arrogance often blinded them to solutions that were simple yet effective. One morning, Kale noticed unusual activity in the communication hub of the palace. A cluster of rogue operatives had managed to infiltrate the secure channels, sending messages that mimicked official orders. Most humans would have panicked if faced with such an advanced system. Kale, however, calmly studied the patterns of the infiltration. He noted the timing, the subtle signals hidden within the data, and the predictable habits of the operatives. Unlike the Zithrians, who expected perfect adherence to protocol, Kale relied on creativity and observation to uncover the weakness. He moved quietly, using the palace corridors as he always did, his presence nearly invisible. When he arrived at the communication hub, the engineers were flustered, their sophisticated systems struggling to detect the intrusion. Kale did not lecture them or demand attention. Instead, he suggested minor adjustments that seemed counterintuitive to the Zithrian mind, redirecting energy flows slightly, reordering sequences in a pattern that appeared chaotic, and introducing unpredictable inputs, subtle changes that humans might take for granted. Within moments, the rogue transmissions were isolated, neutralized, and rendered useless. Word of his success spread quietly through the court. Livrin, who had been observing from a distance, felt a mix of irritation and admiration. The young prince had never encountered a being whose intelligence was so unlike his own. Most Zithrians relied on the certainty of knowledge, but humans operated on flexibility. Their advantage was their ability to think outside established frameworks. Livrin realized that Kale's strength was not in technology or brute force, but in subtle ingenuity. The rogue faction, however, was relentless. They recognized the human as a threat and began to adjust their strategies. Kale, always alert, noticed small anomalies, a delayed energy pulse here, a misdirected report there. While others saw random mistakes, Kale interpreted them as deliberate moves. He began anticipating the faction's next steps, creating contingencies that seemed almost invisible. The palace became a chessboard, and Kale moved pieces without revealing his strategy. One evening, as the twin moons cast silver light over the palace, Livrin approached Kale in the library. The grand hall filled with floating holographic records. Of centuries, you're more capable than I thought, Livrin admitted. His tone lacked the arrogance of before, replaced with curiosity and a hint of concern. Most humans I have met are reactive. You are different. You do not respond as expected. Why? Kale regarded him calmly. Because what matters is not reaction, but understanding. You act based on what you think will happen. I act based on what could happen. You follow patterns? I create them. The prince paused, realizing that this human was a puzzle he could not easily solve. Humans were underestimated not because they were weak, but because their strength was subtle, unpredictable, and strategic. Livrin, for the first time, felt uncertainty. The young prince, accustomed to commanding obedience and respect, had never faced someone who refused to play by expected rules. The next challenge arrived sooner than expected. The rogue faction launched a coordinated attack on the planetary defense system itself. They did not simply infiltrate the communication channels, they attempted to override critical components that could destabilize the planet's protective shields. The engineers panicked, and even some of the palace guards began to doubt their ability to stop the crisis. Kale observed quietly, noting weaknesses in the system that the Zitharians had overlooked. Their overconfidence in technology made them blind to simple contingencies. Kale acted quickly, but carefully. He coordinated with a few trusted engineers, introducing subtle diversions and rerouting energy in ways that appeared accidental to the Zitharians, but were deliberate and strategic. He anticipated every move of the rogue faction, countering each intrusion with precision. The Zitharians marveled at his calmness, unaware of the full extent of his planning. Within hours, the sabotage attempt was fully contained, the threat neutralized, and the system restored to stability. Livrin observed the aftermath in silence. He could no longer deny the human's brilliance. Kale had not sought recognition or reward. His actions were quiet, effective, and deliberate. The young prince realized that this was a form of power the Zitharians rarely encountered. Humans did not rely on superiority or status. They relied on ingenuity, patience, and adaptability. Kale had demonstrated all three in ways the palace had never seen. That night, Kale walked alone through the palace gardens. The twin moons reflected in the tranquil pools, and the soft hum of energy from the palace seemed almost soothing. He reflected on the events of the past weeks. Every insult, every underestimation, had been a tool. Each challenge had been an opportunity to learn, observe, and act. Humans survived not because they were the strongest, fastest, or most technologically advanced. They survived because they adapted, because they anticipated, and because they acted when others hesitated. Livrin followed him quietly. "You move with purpose," the prince said softly. "And yet you never boast, never demand recognition." "Why?" Kale smiled faintly. "Recognition is irrelevant. What matters is results. If the threat is stopped, if the system is secure, then the goal is achieved. Nothing more is needed." The prince considered this, realizing that humans measured success differently from Zitharians.
Accolades?
Where his people sought accolades and validation, humans often acted for the greater good, silently, without expectation of praise. It was a kind of power the Zitharians had overlooked, a quiet, resilient strength that could not be easily challenged. As the days passed, Kale continued to observe, learn, and subtly influence events in the palace. He noticed cracks in the rogue faction's plans, gaps in their coordination, and overconfidence in their strategies. By understanding their psychology and anticipating their moves, Kale was able to stay one step ahead. Zitharians continued to underestimate him, assuming his interventions were mere coincidence. But Kale knew better. Humans thrived where others failed, because they could think differently, act unpredictably, and endure patiently. The rogue faction's leader, a tall, angular Zitharian with a calculating mind, finally realized that they were being outmaneuvered by a human. Frustration and disbelief spread among their ranks. They had expected the invader to react predictably, to falter under pressure, and to make mistakes. Instead, Kale's calm observation and strategic thinking neutralized their efforts at every turn. They began to see him as a true threat, one that could not be dismissed by arrogance or technology alone. Livrin, observing the chaos from his vantage point, felt a mix of pride and unease. He admired the human's abilities, but also recognized that Kale's influence had shifted the balance of power within the palace. The young prince had never seen someone act so decisively without seeking credit, without being bound by pride or protocol. was both impressive and unnerving. Kale, meanwhile, remained focused on the mission. He knew the rogue faction would not give up easily. Each small victory was a step toward understanding the greater structure of the Zitharian court, their technology, and their vulnerabilities. He relied on patience, strategy, and human ingenuity, turning every challenge into an opportunity. By the end of the week, the palace was secure, and the rogue faction had been temporarily subdued. Kale had demonstrated that humans were not to be underestimated. The young prince now regarded him not with disdain, but with cautious respect. Livrin began to see the subtle power humans possessed, a power built not on size, strength, or technology, but on intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. Kale knew that the challenges were far from over. The rogue faction would regroup, and the palace itself held secrets yet to be revealed. But he also knew that humans had a unique advantage. They could survive and thrive where others relied solely on logic and expectation. And with patience, observation, and strategic action, Kale would continue to prove that humans were capable of more than the Zitharians had ever imagined. As he walked through the moonlit corridors, Kale felt a quiet satisfaction. The insult he had received upon arrival had been transformed into motivation. Every observation, every subtle intervention had reinforced the truth he'd carried with him. Humans were strong. It's not because they demanded respect, but because they earned it silently through ingenuity, adaptability, and unwavering resolve. The young prince, once dismissive and arrogant, would learn that lesson in time whether he liked it or not. Kale quickly realized that surviving the palace was not about blending in, it was about observing everything, noting patterns and understanding the subtle rhythms of the Zitharian world. Every hallway, every guard, every flicker of the holographic lights carried information. While most humans might have felt intimidated by the constant scrutiny, Kale found it exhilarating. In this environment, the very underestimation of humans became an advantage. The day began like any other. Kale moved through the marble corridors of the palace, his steps measured, his gaze calm, but always aware. Servants passed by, their movements precise and rehearsed. Guards stationed along the corridors glanced at him, but did not approach. They did not need to. The palace itself was a labyrinth of observation points, sensors, and surveillance. Yet Kale seemed invisible, not because he was hidden, but because he acted in a way that made them underestimate him. The Zitharians had grown so used to expecting reaction, emotion, or fear from others that Kale's calmness confused them. It was a power they had not prepared for. Kale paused near a side balcony, watching a group of nobles discussing trade routes. For the outer colonies, their conversation was complex, full of advanced mathematical terms and strategies that humans rarely encountered. Kale didn't need to understand every equation. What mattered were the patterns of their logic, the predictable ways they solved problems, the assumptions they made, and the small blind spots they ignored. While Zitharians relied heavily on their advanced intelligence and their history of superiority, Kale understood one critical truth. Human ingenuity thrived in unpredictability. Prince Livrin's shadow appeared before Kale had even noticed him. The young prince's eyes glowed faintly, scanning the human like one studies a curious experiment. Kale did not flinch or look away. For someone like Livrin, used to intimidation working effortlessly, this calmness was unsettling. It drew attention from both the guards nearby and the advisors around the court. No one had expected Kale to navigate the palace without showing the slightest hint of distress. "You move differently than I expected," Livrin said, his voice calm but carrying a trace of irritation. "Most humans stumble, hesitate, and break. Under observation, you do none of these things." Why, Kale considered answering, but realized that words were not the weapon he needed here. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and let the silence speak. The prince's eyes narrowed, and he realized that Kale's strength was not in defiance, but in patience. Patience and quiet strategy. The day progressed, and Kale began to take note of the palace's daily routines. He watched how the guards rotated, how messages were delivered through secure energy channels, and how even the servants moved with exact precision. These small observations allowed him to understand how information flowed and where the weak points might lie. It wasn't about spying, it was about learning. While the Zitherians believed their superiority was absolute, Kale saw how rigidity could be exploited. One afternoon, Kale found himself in the vast library of the palace. Rows of glowing holographic books floated in midair, each containing knowledge. Collected over thousands of years, Kale studied them silently, comparing the Zitherians' technological achievements with those of humans. While their advancements were staggering, he noticed that their reliance on logic, predictability, and technology sometimes blinded them to simpler solutions. Humans had thrived for centuries not by perfection but by adaptability. Where the Zitherians saw limits, humans often found opportunity. While Kale examined the data, he overheard a discussion between two advisors about a potential threat from a rogue faction of Zitherians. This group had grown dissatisfied with the current order, believing the royal family's decisions were flawed. Their plan involved sabotaging tarrying with the planetary defense systems. Most of the court treated the threat with dismissive confidence. "Our technology is flawless," one advisor said. "No human, no rogue faction could compromise it." Kale listened carefully, noting every detail. He did not speak, but his mind worked, tracing scenarios, identifying potential weaknesses in systems designed to seem perfect. Even the most advanced technology could fail under conditions no one expected, and humans excelled at exploiting the unexpected. The next morning, Kale moved through the corridors with a subtle purpose. He observed the engineers working on the defense systems and quietly asked questions about operational procedures, always phrasing them innocently as though curious rather than probing. The engineers explained their work with pride, confident that no outsider, especially a human, could understand or disrupt it. Kale noted everything: timing sequences, energy flows, redundancies, and what systems lacked immediate monitoring. Meanwhile, Laverne observed Kale from a distance. The young prince was frustrated. He'd expected humans to be easy to dismiss, yet Kale's quiet intelligence made him reconsider his assumptions. The prince began testing Kale in small ways, sending minor challenges, observing reactions, expecting flustered responses or visible panic. But Kale's calm, deliberate behavior remained unchanged. Every test failed to produce the reaction Livron desired, and with each failure, his curiosity grew. Over the following days, Kale continued to navigate the palace with this quiet, strategic patience. He spent time among the engineers, learning subtle techniques and understanding how the systems interacted. He observed the guards, noting patterns in patrols and communication methods. He watched the court, noting the hierarchy, alliances, and rivalries. Every detail added to his growing understanding of the palace as a living, moving organism, and every observation reinforced the human advantage: adaptability, creativity, and unpredictability. One evening, while Kale walked through the gardens under the twin moons, Livern appeared beside him. "I do not understand you," the prince admitted. His tone lacked arrogance, replaced instead with something closer to curiosity. "You do not react as I expect. You do not seek approval, fear, punishment, or attempt to dominate. Why?" Kale looked at him calmly. "Because it does not matter what you expect," he said quietly. "What matters is understanding, observing, and acting when necessary." Livern studied him, perhaps realizing for the first time that humans operated under a different set of rules. They were not predictable, nor were they easy to categorize. Their value was subtle, embedded in thought, creativity, and the ability to survive against impossible odds. In the days that followed, the rogue faction made its move. Sabotage attempts began quietly: small system glitches, unusual data spikes, and subtle failures. The Zitherians were initially confident they could resolve them with brute force and procedural response, but Kale noticed patterns the others missed. He quietly prepared solutions in his mind, connecting disparate details to form strategies that were unexpected and unconventional. The first confrontation came when one of the rogue agents tried to override a section of the planetary defense system. The Zitherian engineers panicked, their logic unable to account for the unpredictable interference. Kale stepped in not with force, but with clear, calm suggestions for rerouting energy flows and using alternative protocols. His solutions were simple, elegant, and effective. Within minutes, the sabotage was contained. The engineers looked astonished. They'd relied on complex, rigid systems and had expected disaster. Kale's human approach, adaptable, resourceful, and unconventional, saved the day. Liverin watched from the observation deck. He did not intervene, yet his face betrayed something new, a grudging respect. The human had shown ingenuity, composure, and the ability to act decisively where others faltered. For the first time, Liverin understood that the human he had insulted was not weak, fragile, or unremarkable. Kale was dangerous, not in strength or speed, but in mind, a threat and a challenge all at once. That night, Kale walked alone through the palace halls. The faint hum of energy and the glow of the holographic symbols cast soft light on the marble floors. He did not celebrate his success. Humans rarely did. Their victories were measured not in recognition, but in results. Kale knew this was only the beginning. The rogue faction had been stopped, but other challenges would come. What mattered most was that the young prince and his court had begun to notice. The subtle, quiet human who had been insulted and dismissed was no longer invisible. They had begun to understand that underestimating humans could be fatal. Kale smiled faintly, knowing the lesson would continue, not through confrontation or pride, but through observation, action, and the quiet, unstoppable ingenuity that defined humanity. Kale had never felt so small in his life. Standing in the grand hall of the Zitherian palace, he looked up at the towering columns, each carved with intricate symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The walls themselves seemed alive, shimmering, with energy that Kale could not begin to understand. For a human, this place was overwhelming, a palace built not just for beauty, but to show power, precision, and the advanced skill of a species far older and far more accomplished than his own. And yet Kale was here, sent as Earth's representative, because someone somewhere had believed that humanity could matter in a universe that already seemed so vast and indifferent. The court gathered around him, a mix of nobles, guards, and servants. Each Zitherian had a tall, angular frame, pale silver skin, and eyes that glowed faintly with intelligence. Their faces were sharp, beautiful, almost sculpted, but Kale could feel the pride radiating from each one. And at the center of them all stood the youngest member of their royal family, Prince Liverin. At 21, Liverin carried the arrogance of his age amplified by the weight of privilege. His eyes, like pools of liquid metal, scanned Kale as if he were a curious insect that had wandered into the wrong room. "Earth," Liverin said finally, his voice smooth but dripping with condescension. "You dare send a human to our court? One so fragile, so unremarkable, and yet you call it diplomacy." He smirked, a small curl of his lips that carried the chill of amusement mixed with superiority. "Shh, tell me, human, does your species often believe it is capable of more than survival?" The words cut deeper than Kale expected. He had faced arrogance before, even from fellow humans. But there was something in Liverin's tone that was alien cold, precise, and dismissive in a way that seemed to measure Kale's worth, down to the last heartbeat. The court laughed quietly, a subtle ripple of amusement that Kale could hear but could not respond to. He felt the eyes on him, expecting to see him stumble, quiver, or beg for mercy in some symbolic way that would entertain the alien nobles. For a moment, Kale considered letting a reaction slip on her. Embarrassment, indignation, but he remembered why he was here. Humanity's value was not in matching their alien technology or in flaunting physical strength. It was in subtlety, in strategy, in the ability to endure without showing weakness. He straightened his back, lifted his chin, and simply turned away. The movement was quiet, almost graceful, but it was enough. A hush fell over the court. No one had expected this human to leave without flinching, without showing the slightest sign of insult or fear. The nobles whispered among themselves, some shocked, some intrigued. Liverin's metallic eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in curiosity. The human had refused to react, had refused to play the game that the Zitharians understood so well. Kale did not leave the palace entirely. He stayed within the guest quarters, a wing built for visiting dignitaries, though he knew that Livren would watch him even there. He spent the first night exploring the palace, carefully observing the technology, the way doors opened without touch, the way light followed paths like rivers through the halls. He took note of the patterns of the guards' patrols, the subtle hierarchy among the servants, and the ceremonial routines of the court. Every detail was a puzzle, a map of the strengths and weaknesses of a species that considered itself invincible. The next morning, Kale began to see how underestimated he truly was. The palace staff treated him politely, but with a distance that suggested they saw him as a curiosity, nothing more. Every attempt to engage him in conversation about human culture was met with polite disinterest, and yet Kale listened, learned more from silence than many learned from shouting. He watched the young prince move through the halls, always confident, always commanding, and he began to understand the human advantage. Humans were unpredictable. Unlike the Zitharians, who relied on logic and expectation, humans could act without rigid rules, could improvise, and could see solutions. Where others saw only protocol, it was during one of these silent observations that Kale first witnessed Livren in action. The prince was meeting with his advisors about a trade dispute on one of their mining colonies. His tone was sharp, and his questions precise. Kale noticed that Livren assumed everyone would answer as expected, following pre-programmed patterns of logic. When one advisor hesitated, the prince's frustration was visible, but he did not notice Kale in the balcony above. Kale realized that this rigidity was a flaw. The Zitharians' brilliance came from knowledge, but their arrogance blinded them to alternatives. Days passed, each one a quiet battle of observation and subtle calculation. Kale did not provoke, did not retaliate, and did not try to prove himself directly yet. He left impressions everywhere he went, simply by existing differently, by being unflappable in the face of ridicule, and by moving through their society without fitting their expectations. Guards who expected panic were confused by his calm demeanor. Nobles who expected flustered responses were intrigued by his silence, and Livren the prince grew restless. One evening, as the twin moons of the Zitharian homeworld cast silver light across the palace gardens, Kale found himself alone in a corridor lined with holographic displays of the galaxy. Livren appeared. Suddenly, his presence announced by the subtle hum of energy that accompanied his movement. He looked at Kale, a strange mix of irritation and curiosity on his face. "You are unusual," Livren said finally. "No one acts this way. No one resists. I expected fireworks, not this calm emptiness." Kale did not answer. He merely tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the prince's presence but refusing to let the interaction dictate his own behavior. Livren studied him, then spoke again, almost to himself. "Perhaps I underestimated humans. Perhaps they are more capable than their reputation suggests." Kale allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to cross his face. The prince would learn in time that underestimating humans was a mistake. That lesson would not come through anger or confrontation, but through patience, observation, and strategy. Humans had survived against impossible odds before, and they could do so again. In this alien court, he would not need to shout, to fight, or to dominate. All he needed was his mind, his quiet resolve, and the patience to wait until the moment was right. And so, Kale continued his silent vigil, walking through corridors of power and whispers, learning, observing, and preparing. The insult from the young prince had been sharp, but Kale had turned it into a tool. He would prove his worth, not through reaction, but through action. In a court where arrogance was currency, silence was a weapon. And Kale was armed and ready.